Welcome, everyone. I know you're listening to this story to fall asleep. So, before we start, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment where and what time you're watching. Now, get comfortable and relax. I'm a seasonal worker at a dying mall in Michigan. I remember when this place used to be popping, especially around the holiday season. But now, the only businesses that are open are a JCPenney, a Goodwill, a Mexican restaurant, a Dunham's Sporting Goods, and the saddest Victoria's Secret you've ever seen. When I was a kid, we would come here right before Christmas. We never really bought anything. I would just throw all my pocket change into the fountain, and we'd eat at the Mexican restaurant. But, most importantly, we'd go see the big man himself, Santa Claus. Even though my parents never told me that Santa was a real mythical being, they did tell me that Santa is a fun game that everyone participated in for Christmas. Looking back now, I just think they didn't want me to spoil the illusion for any other kids at school. This Christmas, I was the mall Santa. I was home from college on Christmas break, and everywhere I applied for work was staffed full. The pay for being this mall Santa was weirdly good for a dying mall. Apparently, some local eccentric rich guy enjoyed making this magic happen, so he sponsored the event every year. The guy was paying me $45 an hour, 5 hours a day for a week. I hopped on that opportunity before anyone else could. The first day of work was easy enough. About 30 families came through. The kids cried as they got their pictures taken, and they told me they wanted V-Bucks and told me I had a skibidi riz. I'm only 21, but these kids were making me feel like I was the actual thousands of years old Santa Claus. I'm not one to critique the younger generation, because I was once that kid calling everyone they, and I screamed butter whenever I got a gold ingot in Minecraft. I'm just glad the kids are all right. The one upside to the gig was that I was really hitting it off with the woman who was playing the elf. She was the mysterious rich man's daughter. Her name was Amara, and boy was she a smoke show. She told me about how her dad has been the CEO of various oil companies, health insurance agencies, and is actually the owner of this mall. She said that he didn't have the heart to close the place because it meant so much to him as a child. The rest of the week went about as you'd expect. Kids, pictures, V-Bucks, and flirting with Amara. On the last day of work, Amara's father came in to meet me. His name was Damien, and he was super cool. He looked like he could be anywhere from 35 to 75 years old. It was hard to get an accurate gauge. Amara told me he uses some weird experimental anti-aging stuff. He came in dressed as an elf and interacted with all the kids, and even handed out $100 V-Bucks gift cards and candy to all of them. He was a superstar. After the night was over, he invited me over to his place for a big Christmas dinner. Christmas wasn't for another 2 days, but he said that he wanted to congratulate me on being his best mall Santa he'd ever employed. I was starving and poor, so going to the strange multimillionaire's house for fancy people food sounded a lot better than another McChicken for the 4th night in a row. It took an hour and a half or so for the chauffeur to get us to their house. They lived in the middle of nowhere, way back up in the woods. The driveway must have been at least 2 miles long. The house was immaculate. It was a giant 25,000 square foot log cabin. The fence and gate that surrounded the property was gilded with various iron work art pieces. The one I locked in on was a nativity scene, but the baby Jesus was missing. I couldn't tell what was in his place, but it didn't seem like that mattered. We got inside, and one of his many butlers gave me a bag. He told me to go take a shower and to meet them in the main dining room. Amara led me upstairs to the bathhouse for me to take my shower. When I say bathhouse, what I mean is a giant room with a bathtub the size of your standard middle-class backyard pool. The walls and ceilings were full of shower heads that must have had a bajillion different settings, and some of them detached from the wall. There were vents all around that let in warm steam that smelled like herbs and spices like rosemary and lavender. I was in heaven. I went to take my clothes off, but Amara was still there looking at me. I hesitated, but she insisted that I undress. She even led the way by doing so herself. I'll spare you the details. After the most amazing shower of my life, Amara and I went down to the dinner table. It must have been 30 feet long, and it was full of food. 5 turkeys all cooked in different styles, 5 vats of mashed potatoes, a bunch of freshly baked bread, mashed butternut squash, veggie platters, 3 hams, lamb chops, beef Wellington, and desserts on desserts on desserts. It was amazing. I ate and ate and ate. All but a few of his employees were eating. The ones who were serving had already eaten their fill. It wasn't until my 5th glass of wine that Damien spoke. Damien, I would like to wish all of you here today a very Merry Christmas. For those of you, and I see many of you, chuckles mirthfully, who have drank too much are free to spend the night. We have plenty of beds and rooms for all. Please keep eating and drinking and making merry. I must now retire to my bedroom. I can't party like I used to. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. We all responded with a boisterous Merry Christmas, and laughed as he left. Amara and I were seated next to each other, and she kept filling my glass with exotic wines that I could never afford. She kept whispering sweet nothings into my ear until it was time for us all to go to bed. She led me to a room that was styled to look like a small, cozy cabin, complete with a fireplace and bearskin rug. Although she offered to stay the night with me, I was too drunk and too tired to partake in Yuletide carols, if you catch my drift. She kissed me and told me good night. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I was out like a light. I woke up around 3 a.m. with a start. I was disoriented since I wasn't in my own bed, but I quickly remembered where I was. I rolled over in the king-sized bed and saw someone laying in bed next to me. The figure was facing away from me, so I couldn't tell who it was. I assumed it was Amara until I heard them speak. Damien, you know, I really did like you. And with that, I jumped out of the bed and ran for the door. When I flung it open, I saw Amara was there. She stabbed me in the neck with some kind of syringe, and within seconds I was slumped over on the floor, still very much conscious. They dragged me down to the basement and chained me up to some pipes that were running along the ceiling. Me. Why are you doing this to me? Damien. Well, we gotta stay young somehow. You see, Amara and I are very old. I'm not a CEO, and my name isn't Damien. It's Dieva. It was Raeva, and I am what you call a Dieva. I'm the last of my kind, so I've taken my classification as my proper name. Me. That doesn't answer my question. Please, just let me go. I'm sorry. Dieva, we've been beaten down and forgotten by your world. You know, around this time of year, we used to be lauded by occultic sects, praised, adored. Now you humans honor that startup god Jesus and that fat red saint. We need your soul. Then his nails elongated into talons, his teeth into fangs. Amara's beautiful form morphed into a grotesque and hideous hag. They both latched their maws to my neck and began to drink. Just before I was about to pass out, they detached. Diva. The soul resides in the blood. It's the tether between this world and the unseen realm. where the divine meets the material. We're going to finish you off on Christmas. Have a good night. Christmas Eve was not enjoyable for me. The butler's force fed me sweet fruits, wine, and bread to get my blood to be more delectable for Diva and Amara. I tried to resist by forcing myself to vomit, but it was no use. They just cleaned me up and stuffed me full. I was about to consign myself to death for tomorrow until I heard a struggle. I heard clanging and clashing. The torrent of footsteps made such a clatter above my head. I began to scream for help. Then it went quiet. It was as still as a crypt in the sticks. Suddenly, I heard loud jingling heavy footsteps coming down the stairs towards the door that led into my prison. The door opened, and the body of Diva appeared. His eyes were rolled back into his head, and he had a huge piece of coal jammed into his mouth, complete with a broken jaw. Then in walked a man clad in red. Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas. Need a lift? I thought missing my dad's funeral was the worst-case scenario. I was wrong. Long drives have a hypnotic effect on you. The passing, broken white lines like a swaying pocket watch from some shady hypnotist telling you to sleep. Not to mention, with the thoughts of your father's body mangled in a hospital bed flashing in and out of your mind, it's safe to say the 15-hour drive from Stony Rapids to Regina felt like years. On my first day driving, around 8 p.m., I had been on the road for 7 straight hours, only stopping once to pee and fill up on gas and snacks. I honestly was not in a good state to drive. Almost no sleep and intermittent periods of intense pain and anxiety that the flat Saskatchewan landscape turned into green oil paintings through my welling tears. Safe to say, when I thought I heard a whisper over the radio, I brushed it off immediately, as just me hearing things through my delirium. Just 30 kilometers from my hotel, I heard it again. This time, I could almost make out a single word. Fault. I quickly look around me. Going 110, I do my best to look behind me and all over the car the best I can without swerving into a ditch. Once again, I chalk it up to my exhausted mind playing tricks on me while in the isolation of my car on a dead road near the middle of the night. But I decided to drive the rest of the way in without any radio, just in case. Just 2 kilometers outside of the town of La Ronge, where I booked my hotel, I heard it again. It's not your fault. I heard in a whisper so quiet that even without the radio, I almost missed it. I immediately jerked my head to my back seat, and through the darkness, I swear, I saw something just fall behind my back seats and into my trunk. I could not make out any sort of figure, but the worst part was the noise. The sound I heard when it jumped in the back was like the scurry of 1,000 rats, as if whatever this thing was had hundreds of legs on all sides of its body moving in unison to stay out of my sight. I immediately pulled over and got out. The cold wind of the night shocking my system as I disrupted my warm hideaway provided by the car's heater. Call me crazy. Call me a pussy, I don't care. I'm exhausted and mentally shot, so if I'm not just imagining things, I want absolutely nothing to do with whatever the hell that was. I'm only a couple kilometers away from my hotel. I'll just walk, go get some rest, and come back to my car when I have a clearer head in the morning. So I quickly grab all my valuables out of the front seats, lock the doors, and write down the location of my car and start walking. I get about half a kilometer down the road when I look back and my car is the same distance behind me as it was when I left. Not like I am in the same spot I did move up the road, but it's like my car was tied to me with some imaginary string keeping it at the same distance. The engine was not on. I had the keys in my pocket. The doors were locked. It's strange what your mind remembers in moments of terror. I remember looking both ways down the road, as if to confirm I wasn't the only one seeing this. I was. This isn't my imagination playing tricks on me anymore. This isn't explainable. No one else is on the road at this time, and I am all alone with a possessed Chevy Equinox. I stood there for what might have been minutes, just looking at my vehicle. Not moving, not started, just sitting there staring back at me, waiting to start walking like a dog, looking at its owner before going on a walk. Finally, I see headlights in the distance heading towards me. I'm snapped back into reality, and without conscious thought, I put my hands up to try and wave down the passing truck. Not surprisingly, a guy flailing his arms around at you on the highway at 1 a.m. isn't exactly a situation most people would feel hospitable in. He just drove by. That didn't overly shock me, but what made my bones tense in fear was what I saw in my car as he drove past. In my back seat, the headlights flashed the silhouette of a massive black mass of fleshy tendrils sloshing around like a puddle of sentient intestines. After about 10 seconds of paralyzing fear, bugs buzzing past my face, with the light-passing truck still imprinting hot white dots in my eyes. I did the only thing my mind could think of. I ran. Never looking back, that thing could have my car. I don't care anymore. I ran and ran and ran until finally I got to the hotel. Running past several other cars in the parking lot over to the check-in desk on the far southern side of the parking lot with the hotel to the north. Only illuminated by the 3 street lights above the parking lot and the spattered lights of occupied hotel rooms. The sight of the lights in the checkout office gave me a feeling of relief sailors must feel after seeing the shine of a lighthouse after clearing a severe storm. I ran up the check-in office and, bursting through the front door, nearly giving the clerk at the front desk a heart attack. The clerk was a 20-something kid with long blonde hair with headphones in and a Dead Kennedys t-shirt on. "You good, bro?" he said, taking out one of his AirPods. "Check in for McNeil," I said through my heavy breathing, slamming my ID on the desk. Okay, the clerk responded, looking around as if he wasn't sure I was just some hallucination from the drugs he was obviously on. "Room 4E, just up the stairs to the north and down the hall," he said, after an agonizing 20 seconds of him looking at the computer and before handing me the keys. I grab the keys, and as I turn around and walk out to the stairs outside, I look out at the parking lot and see a white Chevy, just sitting directly in the middle of the parking lot. There were a few other cars in the parking lot. I only saw it from the side, so I wasn't certain it was mine. I was exhausted. I could barely see straight. I had just ran for 20 minutes straight, and I had experienced something I couldn't even explain with a clear mind. I had no plan, but for whatever reason I began to walk towards the car to check the license plate and confirm it was mine. It was. I walked up towards the side of the vehicle, and as I made my way to the back, I saw the whole thing shift side to side, as if whatever this thing was staring at me, following me completely by rotating its entire body to face me. I could see its jet black, slimy tendrils illuminated by the street light further down the parking lot, slinking forever forward as if it had no end. Its disgusting form faces me like an unholy abomination that defies all logic, looking at me destroying my concept of biology and reality just by existing. My mind became a blur. Everything that had happened to me over the last few days hit me all at once like a runaway train. I was overcome with emotions and my knees buckled. I was now on my knees in the middle of the parking lot, that thing looking over me as if I was bowing to its command. Just then, I was startled out of my trance by the front desk clerk suddenly appearing in front of me, giving me a look of concern with his headphones in his hand though I could still hear the heavy metal instrumentals blaring through them. It seems my existential crisis in the parking lot looked like something he should probably deal with from his desk window. "Hey man, do you need me to call someone for you?" he said sincerely. I looked up at him and somehow felt a moment of comfort. This kid seemed genuinely concerned for me. Maybe he'll understand. Maybe if I explain to him what is happening, we can figure a way out of this situation together. Just as I had this thought and opened my mouth to speak, I noticed the door to my trunk behind him open slightly. "Look out." Before I could even finish the two words, the creature in my back seat had slipped one of its hellish tentacles out of the back and slit the clerk's throat from ear to ear, before slowly slipping back into the trunk of my car, using it as some sort of protective shell. I'll never forget the face he made. The look of concern was replaced with shock and terror in the blink of an eye. Blood spurting out of his now open carotid artery with the rhythm of his slowly dying heartbeat. I just sat there on my knees, the brief second of hope I had dying as quickly as he did. As the kid fell to the floor, blood pooling like a lake, I still sat there motionless. Some desperate part of me wanted this to still be a dream or some fucked up hallucination brought on by grief-induced exhaustion. As much as I tried to wake up or confirm to myself this wasn't reality, the kid's lifeless body still lay in front of me, growing whiter and whiter with every passing second. Just as my reality was once again collapsing, my driver's side door opened. "They're gonna blame you for this, you know," a high-pitched voice whispered in my ear as if right behind me. "No, they won't. You did this." "Not me," I shouted back. As a result of my shouting, several of the occupants of the hotel rooms around me turned on their lights, some looking through the drapes at the commotion. "You think they'll believe you?" It responded, seemingly genuinely curious of my response. I didn't say anything. They wouldn't believe me. I looked around the parking lot. There were no cameras, several people watching now. All the police would see is a man going through mental anguish and a kid with his throat slit in the middle of nowhere. "Just drive to the police station. I'll be in the back seat. You can show them firsthand you're not crazy and you didn't do this," it whispered. I was now rocking back and forth in complete hysteria. I don't know if I was mentally shot or I had subconsciously completely given up at this point, but I began to consider it. Realistically, it was right. What options did I have? Either I could get in the car and probably be killed, or I could go to the police alone and try to explain myself and be disowned from my family and locked away in a mental institution or prison for the rest of my life. No matter what my life was over, I couldn't live with the guilt that I had inadvertently led this kid to a gruesome death. I had to tell someone I couldn't live this way. Either I come clean or I die, and both options seemed equally dreadful. So, against all of my body screaming at me to stop, I got in my car. I almost felt a fraction of a second of comfort as I remembered the warmth on my heater still trapped inside. Once I sat down and closed the door, I felt a sort of stomach-dropping regret I can't even describe to this day. "It's not your fault," it whispered. "I know it's not. You killed him. You killed me," I responded in a low, aggressive, but broken tone. "Let's go talk to the police. Let's figure this whole mess out," it said after some silence. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed to the police station on the other side of the town, a short 5-minute drive away. "You're special, you know. He gave me you. Of all people he could have chosen, he chose you," it said just a minute into the longest drive of my life. I didn't want to respond. Whatever the hell was happening was something beyond my understanding. But eventually, I realized if I was going down, I might as well know why. Who? I responded. Your father, it whispered. I slammed on the brakes and looked in the rearview mirror. Just in the moment, it occurred to me how large this thing was. It tensed in fear like a child about to be scolded by their parents. Even in its tense state, it still took up the entirety of the back of my car. I couldn't see a sliver of my rearview window. Just the sight of it made my stomach turn in with dread. Don't you ever talk about my father. He would never let you do this to me, you son of a bitch, I screamed through my tears that seemingly had no end. Oh, I'm sorry. Your father did want to protect you. On his deathbed after the accident, he prayed for your protection. I just think he didn't realize who he was praying to. It responded. I slumped in my chair. What was left of my sanity was now gone. I looked out my driver's side window and into the inky black void that was my surroundings. Only light coming from my headlights and the street light a kilometer down the road. Without another word, I shifted the car back into gear and started driving again. I think you'll learn to appreciate me after a while. It was your dad's wish for me to look over you after all. It continued, whispering and whispering, never shutting the fuck up until I would completely collapse and fall apart at the seams. I turned onto the road the police station was on, a long road with a dense forest on my right with thick spruce trees all along the road. Nearing the end of the road, close to the station, I noticed an extremely thick tree at the end of the road. If this thing was right, and I'm destined to be watched over by this thing from some sick bastardization of my father's final wishes, then I wasn't giving it the satisfaction of having me for long. My foot slowly pushes the gas pedal. As my car gets faster and faster, I unbuckle my seatbelt. I wanted to make a prayer for my family in these brief seconds, but I didn't know what could be listening, so I simply let the trees rush past as I reached 120 kilometers per hour. As I was just 300 or so feet away from my fate, it spoke one last time. A white 1981 Oldsmobile pulled into the front of Lone Oak Middle School. A disheveled man in his mid-30s looked over at his daughter, who still sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed and a scowl plainly on her face. Scarlett, I am sorry. I could have sworn that I set my alarm last night. Leo Parker apologized as he watched his daughter unfasten her seatbelt. She tossed her hair over her shoulder and grabbed her backpack. I can definitely say goodbye to my perfect attendance record. Scarlett mumbled under her breath. He frowned and brushed a hand through his hair. Leo knew this was important to his daughter, but he did not know what more he could do to apologize. Why don't we get ice cream from the Cone Zone after school? Will that make up for it? Dad, I haven't been there since I was like 4. She groaned in annoyance, rolling her eyes, and opened the car door, stepping out. Have a good day, sweet pea. Leo waved as the door was shut and muffled his words. Watching her retreating figure walk down the cement path and into the building. He turned towards the steering wheel, gripping it tightly. Leo had been raising Scarlett by himself, ever since the woman he had relationship with dropped her off on his doorstep. Whether she was really his or not, he raised her. Shifting the car into first gear, he drove off, following the curve of the road that looped around the hill leading to a stop sign. Leo Parker worked from home as an editor and set his own schedule, which was helpful, while having a preteen to take care of. At times, he felt like he was not in her life enough, or maybe he tried to get too involved, hoping that he was doing this whole thing correctly. When Leo got home, he tossed his keys onto the counter and kicked off his shoes at the door, walking into his office to power up his computer. He opened his email, and noticed that a writer reached out to him about editing a short story of theirs to be sent to a magazine, Tilted, Bones, and Birch Trees. As he was reading over it, the premise was about Baba Yaga from Slavic folklore. He remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about her, mostly to get him to behave, and other times to warn him. Leo would always ask her, "How will I know it is her?" She would simply shake her head and say, "When the winds turn wild, and there is whistling through the trees which will creak and moan, and the air turns bitter cold." Those words always sent a shiver down his spine, and still does to this day. Time went by as he made a few edit notes and sent it back to the writer. Leo looked at the wall clock of his office. One of those antique cuckoo clocks let him know it was now time to go pick up Scarlett from school. Arriving at the school, he noticed his daughter was standing off to the side by herself, while a group of kids talked to each other while glancing her way. Leo frowned. Was she being bullied? Once Scarlett spotted him, she rushed up to the door and got inside. "Hey, Sweet Pea, how was you?" he began, but she cut him off by replying, "Can we just go home, please?" Scarlett fastened her seatbelt and looked down at the floorboard of the car. He frowned and nodded, figuring she needed some space before he could ask her what was going on. When they got home, Scarlett went directly to her bedroom and shut the door behind her. With this time, Leo decided to make them some dinner, one of his daughter's comfort foods. Whenever he felt down, it always helped put him into a better mood. Taking out the ingredients together, he got to work. Scarlett slinked out of her room to peer into the kitchen from the archway leading into the kitchen. "Is that French toast?" she asked, causing her father to jump and acknowledge her burning his hand on the frying pan. He let out a curse. Leo rushed to the sink, turning on the cold water and holding his hand under it. "It seemed like you were having a bad day, so I thought you'd like one of your comfort foods." Leo smiled, cutting off the water and drying his hand off on a hand towel. She smiled and scratched at her left arm. "Thanks for doing this." He nodded. "Of course, Sweet Pea." While they ate, Scarlett opened a bit about her day as she sketched in her drawing pad. She recently had one of her drawings displayed for a contest, and it was stirring up a fuss because of the subject itself. Scarlett had chosen folklore as her theme, and drew Baba Yaga. Students were saying that it moved, or sometimes the figure went missing. They began calling her a witch, a freak. Scarlett frowned, pressing down a bit too hard with her pencil, causing the lead to snap. "Everything okay?" Leo asked his daughter, looking up from his plate. She nodded, putting down her drawing pad and pencil. "Yeah, just, school stuff." "School stuff, huh? Are your classmates giving you trouble?" "Kind of." Scarlett sighed. "I had one of my art pieces displayed recently, and brows furrowed. She rubbed her hands over her knees. I think it's haunted." "So, what exactly did you draw?" Leo sat upright in his chair, looking his daughter, who met his gaze. "Baba Yaga. I remembered when you used to tell me stories about her like the ones you were told growing up. Since then, weird things have been happening with it. My classmates started calling me a witch." She told him, worried he would get upset, but he kept his composure, nodding and listening. "Would you like me to go talk to your teachers or the principal about this?" Scarlett shook her head. "Nah, it should pass. I'm sure they will get over it eventually." Leo hoped that it would too. Kids can be cruel to each other, and even push those they bully to take their own lives, and that was something he didn't want to happen to her. "Thanks for dinner." Scarlett smiled and stood with her empty plate, placing it inside the sink. She excused herself and went to her room, leaving behind her drawing pad. As he cleaned up the kitchen, he noticed Scarlett's drawing pad, opened on a page that looked like a rough sketch of an old woman leaning on a cane, her eyes focused on something off in the distance. He picked it up and flipped through it, seeing not one but multiple rough drafts of the same woman, and on the very last page was scribbled writing. "She's watching me, and everywhere I go, I see her. What do I do? Who can I talk to? Would anyone even believe me if I told them?" Leo's heart thumped in his chest as he closed the drawing pad. It's just a drawing. No need to jump to conclusions or worked up over nothing, he told himself. Making his way upstairs, he knocked on Scarlett's door. "You left your drawing pad on the table." When he was met with silence, Leo placed the drawing pad on a table outside the bedroom door. Sometime during the night, a scream woke Leo up from his sleep. Parental instincts kicking in, he leapt out of bed and ran to Scarlett's room, swinging the door open. Flipping the light switch on, he looked around the room, not seeing his daughter anywhere. "Scarlett, sweet pea, where are you?" His voice was panicked as he looked all around the room, not finding her. She wasn't the type to run away. So, where could she have gone? As he was about to investigate the rest of the house, his foot bumped against something on the floor. It was Scarlett's iPad, the screen still turned on. He picked it up, his eyes widening at what was there. A drawing of Baba Yaga and his daughter standing across from each other. The old woman handing Scarlett something that he couldn't identify. Why had his daughter been taken? What would become of her? After reporting Scarlett missing to the police, they did their investigation, coming up with no evidence of her disappearance. Therefore, it was just written off as a runaway teen, and missing posters were distributed in the area. Some time had passed, and Leo engrossed himself into his work to get his mind off things. Checking his emails for clients, he came across an article that was sent to him. Recently, a string of missing teens from Lone Oak Middle School has gone viral. As parents have said when checking on their children at night, they walk into empty bedrooms with only a pool of blood left on their beds. Some believe this might be a suicide pact, while others think that it's a kidnapping by an unknown individual. Leo leaned back in his chair, staring at the article in disbelief. First, it was Scarlett, and now more kids from her school were disappearing. Could it be the ones who had bullied his daughter? Looking up at the drawing on his office wall, the one his daughter had displayed for the drawing contest shifted and morphed, taking the shape of Scarlett herself, a content smile on her face. A loud creaking jolted the man awake from his peaceful sleep. The sound resonated through his house as if someone was walking around downstairs in the living room. Rolling over in bed, he turned to his wife to find her sound asleep. "Karen," he whispered, gently shaking her by the shoulder. "Did you hear that?" She turned away, muttering, "Go back to sleep. It's probably the raccoons again." The man settled back into bed, trying to get back to sleep. But less than a minute later, he heard a loud stop. There was no denying this time that something was there. The only question running through his mind now was, is that noise inside or outside? Throwing the covers off, he hoped out of bed, rushing straight for his closet. Pulling his shirts out of the way, he pressed his thumb onto the panel of his gun safe, unlocking it with a click. He took out his M4 shotgun, racking around into the chamber and turning on the mounted flashlight. If it wasn't just raccoons, he didn't want to take any chances. Closing the safe back, he quietly crept toward the bedroom door, listening for the creak again. He held his breath, waiting for the sound, but it never came. Deciding he needed to go check if his wife was right, he swung open the bedroom door, peering out into the empty hall. At a glance, nothing seemed out of place, and he swore he would have heard if anyone had stumbled up his noisy staircase. Looking down at the staircase, he was annoyed it was his problem to deal with now. Heading down to the main floor, he kept his eye on the glow of his flashlight, trying his best to move quietly. Despite his best efforts, the steps let out creaks and squeaks every other step. At the bottom of the stair, he stood still again, patiently waiting for any sounds, scanning over the living room. Standing in the stillness of the night, he almost managed to convince himself to just go back to bed. That his wife was right, and the raccoons were just being mischievous tonight. Then a crash came from the back of his house. It was so loud, the man wondered if a tree had fallen on his deck, and how his wife could stay sleeping through all of this. Moving carefully, though the house, he headed toward the back deck off the kitchen. The crashes and creaks had settled, letting the quiet of the night return. As the man got closer to the glass doors leading out to the deck, he could hear a faint crunching. It was a relaxing sound that let him relax, loosening the grip on his shotgun. His wife must have been right. It wasn't an intruder, just a rowdy animal stopping by for a late-night snack. Still, while he was here, a quick shine from the flashlight mounted on his gun ought to scare off the critters and let him get back to sleep. The man panned his flashlight out through the glass doors, expecting to see a frightened raccoon scurrying off the deck. Instead, light illuminated onto 4 narrow fleshly legs, holding up an amorphous sack of flesh. A long neck sprouted from the body, precariously holding up a head with a sagging face. The creature looked back through the glass with a raccoon tail dangling from its mouth. Hollow eyes looked into the light, and the face seemed to smile, tilting up the sagging corner of its mouth. Before he knew it, the man was tightly bracing the shotgun to his shoulder. 2 rounds of buckshot fired out from the gun, shattering the glass door. The ringing out of the glass blended in with his blaring phone alarm, jolting the man awake in his bed. Fumbling to turn off the alarm, he sat in bed, wiping the sweat off his face, confused at what was going on. It was just a dream, he told himself, but it felt so real. His hands were trembling, and he could still feel the tension in his shoulder from firing the shotgun. He turned toward his wife, but she wasn't in bed. Dragging himself out of bed, he threw on clothes, hoping talking to his wife would bring back the feeling of normalcy. Getting ready for the day felt heavy, like moving through a fog, as if this was the dream and not last night. Heading downstairs in the light of day, everything seemed normal through the house, but he couldn't shake his dream. His wife was waiting for him in the kitchen, buttering some toast. He was about to sit down, but found himself heading to the glass doors. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "I just had a bad dream." Compelled to check out the doors, pressing against the glass. Everything seemed fine, but touching the glass brought back the memories rushing from his dream. Still in the effects of the heavy fog, he headed back upstairs to his closest, examining his gun safe. Opening up the safe, he backtracked through last night's events. Holding the shotgun in his hands, he clung to the fading memory. He told himself again that it was just a dream as he unloaded his shotgun, counting the rounds. All the rounds were accounted for, making him feel more than a little silly for checking. He loaded them back into the shotgun, not sure what he had been expecting. Placing the shotgun back in the safe, the box of shotgun shells on the bottom shelf seemed ajar. He figured he must have bumped it taking out the shotgun, but after seeing the box, he couldn't stop himself. Opening the box, he counted through the remaining shells, and 2 were missing. Susan Grayson started her day with a cup of coffee and whatever her youngest child would not finish for breakfast, as she rushes him and her oldest out the door and into the car to ensure they would not for school. While dropping them off, she would meet up with the rest of the PTA moms to catch up on things. It was usually gossip or what the next fundraiser goal would be, and who would be baking what. "By the way, Susie," her childhood friend Helen spoke up, getting her attention, since she had been zoning out during the whole conversation that always left her out every time. "Yeah?" Susan cleared her throat and looked up from her thermos of now cold coffee. "Well, my next-door neighbor, the one with the Tesla. She asked if I wanted to join her book club. They found this old book that has never been released to the public before." Helen twirled a blonde curl around her index finger as she spoke, looking at each one of them, trying to see if anyone was interested in joining as well, but they all declined. Susan frowned, seeing the disappointment on her friend's face, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I will join the book club with you. I have some free time when Tom comes home from work so he can watch the kids for at least a little while." Helen's bright eyes light up. "Thank you, Susie. I knew I could count on you." She nodded and proceeded to leave the school and head home for the day. Susan went about her day doing her daily chores and planning out what to make for dinner that week, since she usually packed leftovers for lunches. When Tom came home with the kids, she walked up to him, giving him a big hug and asking how his day went. He gave her a tired nod, and as usual, it was work response. Susan smiled and held his hand for a short while before he went to go shower and sit down to dinner with his family. During that time, she would bring up the book club. Helen asked if I would join a book club with her. Susan casually brought up poking her fork into the green beans on her plate. Tom tilted his head to the side, chewing a bit of meatloaf before responding. The blonde? I honestly did not think she had ever picked up a book before. The children snickered, and his wife pouted. "Thomas." She scolded, and he shrugged, taking another bite before sipping his drink. He always disliked Helen, ever since they had met back in high school when she had introduced Tom as her boyfriend back then. Tom told Susan that Helen was clingy and always got her into some type of trouble. "If you want to go, I don't mind watching the kids for a while." "Thank you." Tom nodded and finished his meal, gathering up the empty plates to wash them in the kitchen. The following day, Susan met up with Helen to walk over to her next-door neighbor's house. A woman with dark, slicked-back hair tied into high ponytail answered the door. "Helen, it's so good to see you." She greeted with a smile, and it faded when she looked at Susan. "Oh, you brought a friend with you." "Is that okay? I am sorry, I should have asked." Helen pouted, and the woman brushed it off. "It's perfectly fine, the more the merrier." The woman muttered and looked at Susan with a forced smile. "Welcome to the book club." Susan shuddered at the look this woman was giving her, and knew that she defiantly did not want her here. Helen gave her a reassuring look and led the way inside, where they joined a few other women in the living room. "Everyone, this is Helen and Susan Grayson." The woman sighed and rolled her eyes. "Mrs. Grayson." Some greeted her, while others ignored her and put their attention on Helen. Susan was used to being ignored, but this felt off. Yes, she was used to Helen getting all the attention wherever they went, but they seemed obsessed with her for some reason. Could this book club be some sort of guise to cover up a cult? Now, let's begin reading from the book. The leader of the book club began taking out a leather-bound tome. The front was scarred, and cracked a lock on its surface long broken and forgotten. When she opened it, the tome's pages were yellowed and brittle, filling the room with sense of dust and decay. She sat upright with a smile on her face, reading aloud in an unknown language. It did not appear to be Latin, nor anything she had ever heard before. A few of the other women clapped their hands and sang something which was like an amen. Helen tilted her head and clapped along with them before speaking up. "What's the translation?" The woman looked up from the book in her hands to the blonde and smiled. "We do not need a translation to know what the words mean, Helen. If you close your eyes and open your heart, you can feel them. You can hear his voice speaking directly to your mind." She smiled, and her eyes locked on Helen's. "Who is he? You said that you can hear his voice." Susan spoke up, causing the others to look at her. The woman closed the book, and a look of disgust spread across her face. "You have just joined us, and yet you dare ask what his name is. First, you must prove yourself before we will ever allow you to utter his name." "Prove myself? We just joined today." Susan thought to herself, raising an eyebrow inquisitively. The woman held her head high and looked away, her eyes settling on the group. "You are dismissed for today. Please return next weekend for another reading." As Helen and Susan left together and out of earshot, she spoke up. "There is something wrong with that book club." "Oh, you're just imagining things." Helen brushed her off with a sigh. "Helen, I'm telling you, those people are a cult." The blonde stopped in her tracks, looking at her childhood friend, Susan. Her voice was stern, and her arms crossed in front of her. "If you keep saying such things, weird rumors will start to spread and innocent people will get hurt. So why do not you keep it to yourself?" "But Helen, Enough, Susan." The blonde turned on her heel. "I'll see you next weekend." Without another word, she went inside her house, leaving Susan completely alone. She needed to stop this, but how could she? Helen did not believe her. She thought that it was just some gimmick to get people to join the book club. How could she prove that they are bad people? Susan could not quit and leave Helen alone with those people her conscience would not allow her to. She would just have to continue to attend and find proof of what is going on between the lines that Helen is too oblivious to see. When the weekend rolled around, Susan was running a bit behind and arrived late at the club meeting. She reached out a hand to knock on the door, only to find it slightly ajar. Curious, Susan pushed the door open with her foot and stepped inside. The entrance was dimly lit and void of any light. Gently shutting the door behind her, she continued further inside, squinting her eyes to see better in the darkness. Thump, scrape, thump. Was that sound from the basement? Next to the stairs was an open door with a red light spilling out across the floor and walls. Taking a deep breath, Susan exhaled slowly, taking her time walking down the stairs where she found herself in an open room with a sacrificial altar in the middle. On top of it was Helen, dressed in white robes with her eyes closed. She slowly made her way over, gently shaking her childhood friend. "Helen?" Susan spoke in an intense whisper, glancing around them. "You're late, Mrs. Grayson." Susan turned, seeing the woman with the slicked-back dark hair and a high ponytail. She turned to face her brows, knitting in a furrowed expression. Susan clenched her hands into fists down at her sides. What had they done to Helen? What did you do to her? "My Mrs. Grayson, I did not know you were capable of such anger. I thought we were doing you a favor." "Doing me a favor? Helen is my best friend. Why would I want anything to happen to her?" The woman tisked, and walked up to the altar. "Either way, you are too late. She will not wake up until the ritual is over. Why don't you finish it for us?" She turned to Susan, handing over a yellowed page. "All you have to do is read the words on the page." She held the page in her hand, looking at the ancient dialect before her. Finish it? No, Susan was not going to do that, was she? Before she knew it, her lips moved on their own, speaking aloud the words which were foreign to her. Helen began to cough her eyes, opening their usual light color, turning pitch black, completely engulfing even the sclera. The coughing became worse, and then the gargling started as Helen spat up blood. The sound of bone and flesh being torn and cracked filled the air, and when Susan looked down, she gasped, almost bumping into one of the members who held her by the shoulders. "Watch with us, Susan, and gaze upon his arrival." The woman raised her arms in the air. They chanted a name, something which came out in gibberish when it was spoken. Volgron. 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 Just what was Volgron? As Susan questioned this, she watched as a creature crawled its way out of Helen's broken open rib cage. It moved and writhed its blood-drenched body out of the broken body under it. She looked up at it, frozen in fear. The creature's body was a blend of corded muscle and jagged bloodstone. Its eyes burned like molten embers, flickering like fire. Hooked horns curved downwards from its skull, its clawed hands dripped with blood. When it roared, the sound was a symphony of death itself echoing off the walls. Whatever this thing was filled Susan with dread, and now she had released it onto the world. I was 18 at the time. I just graduated high school, and what was probably a really exciting and memorable time for most people was a stressful race against time for me. You see, my dad was very traditional. If I were going to be living in his house after high school, even just over the summer between graduation and college, I needed a job. If not, I was freeloading, and he swore with an adamance I certainly didn't care to test that I'd be out on the street if I was unemployed for long. I'd had months of preparation. Hell, years, really. This entire time I could have been looking. He certainly hadn't waited until now to clue me in on the terms of living with him after high school, but I just wasn't the type to care that much about anything until I was days from a deadline. Finding a job back then wasn't easy. I'd dyed my hair green, and my nose and lips were pierced, not to mention the gauges and the shitty stick and poke snake on my forearm that my 16-year-old self had afflicted upon me. Case in point, I wasn't getting hired most places, and being that I had about a week at the time left to figure it all out, like usual, I was in a mad scramble to line something up before facing the consequences. But then, as if some morbid miracle, a cop got shot and killed on 84th Avenue pretty close to the pass and Go Out There, and an opening for the night shift position appeared not long after. The Pass and Go and 84th Avenue as a whole had a pretty bad reputation. See, 84th was one of the only roads in town still unpaved at parts, namely the north end shortly after the Pass and Go. And it wound along a pretty deep drainage ditch where no guardrails had ever been built, even after decades of complaints. There was a particularly tight bend up the road where a lot of drunk drivers and speeding teens learned that they were not, in fact, invincible, some of them even taking that lesson to the grave with them, and the lack of streetlights just made it all the more dangerous. But those were just the logical concerns. In a tiny town like mine, people are bored enough to run with sensational bullshit. And so 84th could never just be a dangerous road with poor construction and lack of safety measures to blame, but was instead cursed and haunted. People died there so often not because it was just a hazardous roadway, but because it was bloodthirsty, evil. People's reception went out on the road not because it was essentially the furthest you could be from town, but because some malicious entity wanted you isolated. You get it. The woods beyond the ditch were even worse. On 3 occasions since the turn of the century, bodies were found out there, 1 a suicide, and 2 in shallow graves. And in a town as small as mine had been, that's a pretty sizable number. For a criminal, though, it only made sense to bury them there. Again, this place was basically abandoned and totally secluded. Really, the only other people that far northwest of town were the wagies at the pass and go, and they weren't getting paid enough to be on the lookout for anything. Not to mention, they had their own weirdness to deal with. All sorts of strange and illegal activities happened in that pothole-ridden parking lot, and why wouldn't it? That place was the last beacon of humanity's presence in the town for miles, until you got to 90th Street, the main road shooting off from the highway. So anybody working there had enough going on at their own doorstep, and wouldn't be paying any attention to cars pulled off on the side of the road with mysteriously heavy duffel bags in the trunk. Suffice it to say, once the position opened, I was the only person in town out of options enough to drop off an application. And, wouldn't you know it, I was scheduled to start 2 days later. I picked it up quick. The job was easy, and though at first I was shadowing a guy that by all accounts could have been undead, I was left to my own devices a week later. To be honest, I actually kind of liked the job at first. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. were pretty standard hours of consciousness for me anyway, and working the graveyard shift finally gave me an excuse to sleep in until 3. It was dead most nights. Sometimes, and I'm not exaggerating, I literally didn't see a single customer. And other nights, the goofiness of my interactions with various druggies kept things interesting. But those kinds of nights aren't what this story is about. The first time I remember being pretty confused was only 2 weeks after I'd started the job. I was pretty stoned at the time, so I tensed up when I saw a cop walking toward the door, but I wasn't complacent enough to blaze it before work without eye drops for fear of these exact situations. Not so much worried about getting arrested, but about what my dad would do to me. I also had a little bit of a heads up in the form of a faulty open sign in the window. The neon would pretty often flicker or dim for some reason when people were coming up to the door. Really couldn't tell you why it happened, but when I was totally fucking off behind the counter, it was my cue to act natural for a minute. And since a bunch of random bullshit was stacked up on the side of the counter to my left, facing the parking lot and the pumps, I couldn't ever see out the windows unless I was actively looking over it. So needless to say, whatever was wrong with that sign certainly wasn't something I was going to try and get fixed. When the cop walked in, I sort of leaned back as casually as possible and tried to make small talk with him so his mind wouldn't wander anywhere else. "See any crazies?" I inquired. "Not yet," he answered, perusing the energy drinks like a selection of fine wines. He sounded pretty bored, and I hoped that that wasn't an indication that he was looking for something to do. "Well, lucky you," I chuckled. "Can't say the same myself." "Yeah?" He settled on a sugar-free monster. He walked over to the counter, and I remember thinking he was either a new guy or one of those officers that just never stopped being motivated, going off his short hair and fresh fade. Though, judging off how young he looked, definitely early 20s, I was going with the former. These were the worst types of cops from my experience. They're always looking for a way to stand out to their higher-ups. "Yeah," I continued. "Saw a lady sleeping in a shopping cart out back. Asked her why the shopping cart, and she said she learned from a TV show that you should never sleep on the bare ground. You learn something new every day, I smirked. That actually happened last week, but who's counting? He actually smiled slightly. Weirdos, man. Yeah. Will that be all? Yeah. $3.29. He tapped his card on the reader, and while the sale processed, I remember actually feeling slightly concerned for the guy. I wasn't a big fan of cops, but one of them had died around here recently after all, and just talking with this guy face to face sort of humanized him to me. As he cupped the top of the drink and slid it off the counter, I said, "Stay safe out there." He glanced at me and raised an eyebrow. "You know something I don't?" "Nah, just, that cop that got shot out here a couple weeks ago." "Huh?" I just stared at him. "Listen." He peered at my name tag for a second. "Carter, you can't believe everything you hear about this place. 84th Avenue. It's just a street, man. Most of what you hear about this place is embellished or even totally made up." Yeah, all right. "Well, have a good night, officer." I paused, squinting at his name tag back. "Brady." He walked off into the night, his energy drink in his hand. At the time, I didn't give that interaction a whole lot of thought. I learned most of my news from memes, and it was definitely possible I'd been wrong. Unlikely, but possible. But over time, stranger things began to occur. And I'm not talking about druggies sleeping in shopping carts. I began to pick up on an anomaly with the neon sign. See, it actually didn't flicker very often. It seemed to at first, but after getting caught off guard multiple times by random people coming in, I realized I couldn't trust it as much as I thought I could. Yet, strangely, though it seemed inconsistent, I realized it always blinked and dimmed for certain people. There was this lady that would come in about once a week and buy a scratch-off ticket. I figured she had to be pretty depressed, because she was always wearing the same clothes, and was coming to this dingy-ass place with relative frequency. Every time she'd ask for the same ticket, Cash Kaiser, and every time I'd slide it to her, she'd smile at me and say, "Maybe tonight's the night." Even in her voice, I could hear how much she needed a break. But I guess tonight was never the night, because a week or two later, she'd always be back, always dressed the same, always buying a colorful strip of false hope that things would suddenly change for her. I tried to chat with her the more she came in, but she wasn't keen on giving away details about her life. She was mostly unresponsive, just nodding or giving me one-word answers, and then she'd head out in kind of a hurry. But her clothes weren't the only thing that stayed the same every time. Every single time she came into the pass and go, that sign would flicker. Now, I could have just been reading into things too much. I wondered if the sign was ultimately connected to a wire through the ground, maybe. And maybe certain people were stepping over it, and those people just kind of came in the same way every time. I didn't really know. I'm not an electrician. But the sort of Groundhog Day that transpired every time she stopped by really did intrigue me. Then, one night in early July, I had another curious experience. I was listening to some podcast about ayahuasca and contemplating if I'd ever take the plunge when the green flicker of my inconsistent early warning system caught my attention. And when my eyes trailed from the neon sign and over the merchandise on the counter to the pumps out in the dark beyond, I saw a guy pumping gas into his truck, probably in his mid-30s. He had this really gruff look on his face, but I wouldn't have paid it much mind except for the fact someone was with him, a girl about my age. While he was by the pump, she was heading into the store. She had black hair down to about her shoulders, and these big brown eyes. Her skin was kind of pale, like she probably didn't get out much, and she wore skinny jeans and a gray top. As soon as I noticed her approaching, I stepped back from the window. I definitely didn't want to creep her out by being seen peeking over the counter through the glass. She came in, and as the chime above the door rang, I couldn't help but glance at her as she beelined to the snacks. She was cute, and I was considering flirting with her at first, but then I glanced over the counter again at the guy in the parking lot, presuming him to be her big brother or dad or something. I didn't want to piss him off, so I decided to keep it casual. She was over by the coolers on the back wall the next time I found her, not looking my direction while she scanned our selection of sports drinks. Then she grabbed a red Gatorade and came walking up to the front. She put the drink and a bag of classic Lay's on the counter, and when I noticed it was almost 4 a.m, I couldn't help but inquire, "What's got you out so late?" I was scanning the items with muscle memory, my eyes meeting hers after she glanced at the counter for a second, as if considering a response. "Nothing really." "Big bro." I flicked my eyes to the guy in the parking lot, and at this, her nose wrinkled. "Ew. No." I thought that was a strange response. "Ew?" I asked as the total popped up on the screen. "It's gross to have a brother?" "It's gross to kiss your brother." She smiled flatly, and I didn't want to seem creepy, but I couldn't help but get on the tip of my toes for a second and peek at him again. No doubt, the guy was in his 30s, and if I had to be more specific, I'd be leaning more toward late 30s than early. He was wearing boots, jeans, and a blue and brown flannel, and had a 5 o'clock shadow I could see from the store. The more I looked at him, the more weirded out I felt. But then again, none of this was my business, and I didn't want to pry. She definitely didn't seem to be with him against her will. "Ah, gotcha," I smiled, but the whole thing felt unignorably off to me as she handed me a 10. "You guys going on a road trip or something?" Something like that. There was this turbulent mix of emotions in her eyes, and while she looked excited, definitely thrilled about something, she also kind of seemed to be longing too. I only got a glimpse of it though, as she unexpectedly asked, "You ever just do something totally crazy? Like overnight?" "I mean, I took a heroic dose of shrooms once on a whim without a trip sitter." I smirked, and she chuckled too, but shook her head. "I didn't mean something like that." She paused. "Anyway, have a good rest of your night." "You too," I remarked, but as she turned and walked away, I felt a steadily increasing urge to say something, to ask her why she was with this guy that looked like he could be her dad, to inquire more about this crazy overnight thing she was hinting at, or this road trip-esque adventure she was on that had her at this infamous gas station at 4 a.m. But I was just too immature at the time, and selfish. Even feeling like I should probably investigate what was happening, probably pay more attention to what was going on, I also felt like I really couldn't be bothered. I told myself that it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't be nosy, but really, I just didn't want to get involved. Though, a moment after she left the store, my curiosity got the better of me again, and I peered over the cigarettes at the truck in the parking lot. She was already inside, and at first, it looked pretty unassuming. It was old and kind of a faded red, with 2x4s in the back under a blue tarp. All in all, nothing suspicious. But when he got to the turnoff onto 84th, and he took a right, I noticed the passenger side window was broken, like it had been punched out. I couldn't see the girl well this far away, But her being in this older guy's truck with the right window shattered made me feel even stranger about the whole ordeal. Something was definitely off. But at the time, my lazy ass just didn't care enough. It was mid-July, though, when the veneer of eccentric late-night patrons was shattered forever, and I was forced to see what was really going on. It began with a loud rumbling from the parking lot. I got immediately uncomfortable as some biker douche rolled up, revving his engine like if it were loud enough I'd give him a discount. Then he climbed off the bike and came stumbling toward the door, the green neon flickering onto him from the window. I could tell just from the counter that he was totally hammered. He could barely even make it inside. He came right to the counter and absolutely reeked of alcohol. "Give me a pack of menthols. Camel," he slurred, leaning onto the counter with his right hand. "You okay, man?" I grabbed it. "The fuck do you mean?" His hostility freaked me out just as much as it annoyed me. "You're obviously drunk off your ass," I replied. "You just drove here on a motorcycle. Seems like a bad idea." "Shut the fuck up and sell me the cigarettes, man." He was glaring at me like he was ready to swing. And though he was so fucked up I don't doubt I could have taken him, he was still a big guy, and it really wasn't worth the trouble. "Your funeral," I muttered, grabbing the cigarettes and noting it was the last pack. Normally, I would have made some quip about that, but with this guy, I just wanted him to leave. When I slid him the cigarettes, he flung his cash at me and almost walked away without his change. Then he stumbled off back out the door, shoving it open so hard I wondered if he broke it. And then, without any warning, as he stumbled along the window toward his bike, his entire body changed. My breathing stifled as I noticed his head was dented in. Multiple of his teeth were missing, and blood ran down his face and soaked his jacket. He was covered from head to toe in cuts and scrapes, and his right arm was broken, the bone jutting out slightly. I stumbled back and tripped, knocking over the vape pens, then almost slipped on them as I scrambled to my feet and chased him out the door, staring in horrified bewilderment as he climbed onto a waterlogged motorcycle, the front of it totally wrecked. "Hey!" I screamed. "Man, are you all right?" He just looked at me, and as he stared into my eyes, his look was totally different than before. He wasn't angry or confrontational or even drunk. He just had this totally sober look of regret. He stared at me a moment longer, then he revved his engine, and somehow he and his obliterated bike sped off into the night, leaving me totally alone in the flickering neon. And then as soon as he disappeared up the road, the sign stopped blinking, steadily shining like usual. I sprinted over to the doors, yanking them open and almost collapsing as I barreled into the back room and landed in the seat of the computer. I pulled up the security camera footage and rewound it a couple minutes, desperate to see if somehow, some inconceivable way, I'd just been seeing things. But though I was willing to believe he wasn't actually injured and it was somehow all in my head, I wasn't at all prepared for the sight of me just talking to the empty air. That's right. The guy never even came in at all. I rewatched my harsh reaction to the absent revving of his engine, my eyes following nothing walking along the window to the door that never opened. Then I realized that I'd never actually grabbed the pack of menthols. My hand stopped over it and handed nothing to no one. It was the same thing for the cash register. And then at last, I watched myself stumble back and fall, flinging shit everywhere in a panic. I ran out the door, screaming into the night, but only I was there. It filled me with a terror so paralyzing, I almost just left right then and there. I sat there at the desk for a moment, shaking, Was I hallucinating? I'd heard you can get permanent, schizophrenia-like psychosis from psilocybin, but this was the first, and only time, I'd ever hallucinated when not on the ship. And as I just stared at the monitor unblinkingly, shaking in place, I really couldn't tell what was more horrific, if I hadn't really seen that, or if I had. But then my eyes gravitated to the one part of my memory that was corroborated by the cameras. The neon. It was dim, and as I unpaused the video, I watched it continue to flicker, all the way until my eyes turned to the end of 84th that I could see. And as soon as they did, it shined like normal again. I rewound the footage again, and sure enough, as soon as I began to react to the phantom motorcycle, the sign started flickering. It flickered the whole time, throughout that whole interaction, until the biker was gone. So, I wasn't crazy. Something suggested there was more going on than me just losing my shit. But then, what the hell had just happened? I didn't even go back to the front as I began racking my mind for all the other times the sign had flickered. And instantly, I recalled the scratch-off lady. I quickly Googled 84th Avenue deaths, thinking that maybe I could identify some of these people. But the first thing that came up was the police officer shooting. Then my jaw dropped as I stared into the memorialized eyes of Officer Brady. I could barely sit still as his eyes looked back at me from the computer screen. The same officer I had spoken to just a month ago, who didn't know about any officer shootings in the area, because he was the officer that would be shot. I kept looking, and before long, I found the scratch-off lady. She was some lonely, divorced woman that committed suicide in the woods a couple miles north of here in 2011. And the biker had crashed into the ditch right off the bend 3 years ago. One of many drunk drivers that didn't react to the turn in time and went face first into the canal. I screamed as the chime above the door sounded, and I heard someone spin around at the front of the store, startled by my reaction. I scrambled to my feet and walked up front, freezing as my eyes met those of Officer Brady's, glinting in the flickering neon. "You good?" He seemed to be both concerned and frustrated. I just stared at him, totally unable to speak. "Yeah." "You on something?" He peered. "No." He looked at me a little longer, but then he walked his immortalized path through the gas station, his gaze drifting over the cooler of energy drinks. I couldn't help but stare right at him, utterly wordless as he moved in almost the exact same way as he had back in June, at last grabbing that same sugar-free monster. Then he walked to the counter, and my hands were shaking as I took the drink from him. "Hey," he looked at me. "You all right?" I stared into the eyes of the dead man. "Personal stuff." "Is something going on? Looked like you were looking at the security camera footage when I came in," he noted, and I listened in silence. "If someone's prowling around here, I could investigate." I wanted to address what was really happening, to pick his mind and see if he was really unaware that he was dead, or if he was just haunting this place, and all of this was an act. Then I began to wonder if maybe this was some kind of time machine, if I could warn him about what was bound to happen to him and prevent him from dying in the first place. But as I recalled the biker's corpse mounting his waterlogged Harley, I came to the conclusion that nothing I said to this visage of the officer was going to save his life. And, I further waged, as soon as he walked out that door, he'd be a corpse too. "You there?" He waved his hand in front of my face. "Talk to me, kid. You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed. "Yeah, I'm fine." I slid him his drink. "You gonna tell me the total?" "It's free tonight." On me. Have a good one, Officer Brady." He blinked. He stood there for a moment as if considering investigating the gas station regardless of my cooperation, trying to get to the bottom of my unusual behavior. And maybe in life he would have. But his fateful march to the street where his life would be taken from him seemed programmed to resume as he suddenly turned and walked out the door, just like he had the last time back in June, taking his energy drink with him. I followed him outside, standing beneath the fluctuating sign as my eyes fell onto the exit wounds in his back, the red streaks oozing from the holes in his uniform. I felt like I could cry at the sight of it. I walked back inside and had made my mind up to quit then and there. I wrote up a note and left it in the manager's office. Then I locked the place up and left the key under the propane cylinder exchange out front, about to text my morning relief where the key was when I froze. I remembered the girl with black hair and big brown eyes. The neon sign that I had once thought of as my early warning customer alert, and now understood to be some kind of paranormal detection radar, had flickered with her entrance too, just like it had for the biker and the scratch-off lady and Officer Brady. In that moment, I became weirdly consumed with this desire to know what had happened to her. Maybe it was because I found her cute, or maybe it was because even in the moment that night, something felt horribly off. But for some reason or another, I became totally invested in figuring out what had happened to her, to the point that I decided to unlock the store and stick around. I went back to the computer, but for some reason, though I was able to find information about other people that had died in the area, some of whom I'd even seen walk into this gas station's very doors in the middle of the night, I was completely unable to find her. And it really ate at me. I went back to the front at some point around 5 a.m., but still, I was just searching on my phone for the girl, though by the time my relief came in at 6 a.m., I still hadn't found shit. And that was my obsession for the next couple days. When I'd exhausted every article about deaths on 84th, I began to wonder if anyone even knew she was dead. So I searched local missing persons, and I looked into all of them, but still, none of them were this girl. It haunted me for days. I began reliving as much of that night as I could, trying to recall every single detail. I could remember her hinting that the guy she was with was her boyfriend, which even then was a red flag. But now, as I remembered that older guy in the parking lot pumping gas in the dark, it filled me with dread. I didn't get that good of a look at him. I could tell he had some stubble and was wearing a flannel, jeans, and boots, but what good was that? As for his truck, I wasn't sure exactly what make or model it was, just that it was red and looked old. I could only assume the punched-out glass was like the biker's motorcycle, something that had taken place after the girl's death, or more likely during. Then I remembered her asking me if I had ever done something crazy and overnight. And, as I mulled over the words for hours, sitting on the back porch, smoking a bowl as the sun set before my shift, I ruminated on all the possibilities such a vague statement could mean. But then, when I remembered her saying she was on something like a road trip, it started to click. The guy she was with, her boyfriend, must have been taking her off somewhere, probably far from her home. Maybe they'd been talking online, probably in secret, because no parent would let their kid date a grown-ass man like that, and she seemed to be about 18 like myself. Maybe he'd driven to where she lived, and this big, crazy overnight decision she made was climbing into this stranger's vehicle that she'd been tricked into thinking was safe, driving with him for God knows how long as he took her to God knows where. And then they stopped at the pass and go on 84th Avenue for gas. At first, that part didn't make sense to me. Yeah, this place was a couple miles south of 90th Street, which came right off the highway. But why wouldn't he stop for gas at one of the many gas stations out there closer to the interstate? Though, the more I thought about it, the more I started to piece it together. If this guy really was from out of state and was trying to get her back to his place undetected, it made sense he didn't pull right off the highway to the nearest gas station where cops could be combing through camera footage. Instead, he drove off to the most secluded road in the whole town, 84th Avenue. I started to feel overwhelmed. I had nothing to go off of to narrow my search, really, and for all I knew, I'd have to look at missing persons listings for people in every surrounding state, and maybe even farther than that. I mean, it was just impossible. But at last, saying a prayer to whoever was listening, I typed in the vaguest string of clues I had. Missing girl brown eyes, black hair, red truck. And then I scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. I searched it first in various counties in Iowa. Maybe she was just from a lower part of the state. But when that didn't yield anything, I searched the same sentence with counties in Missouri at the end, and then Kansas, and then Nebraska. And then, after over an hour of looking, my heart skipped a beat. I saw those big brown eyes looking back at me through my cell phone screen. I clicked on the news article, and there, in her missing persons listing, was unmistakably the girl's face, just like the one in the gas station. I immediately read the article, like it was some sort of divine revelation. Her name was Amber Wicker. She would have just turned 18. In fact, her birthday was only 2 months ago, but her disappearance was 4 months ago, which meant that on the night that she'd actually stepped into the gas station and not the memory I had cohabitated, she was only 17, making the whole thing even more disturbing to me. She was last seen on her front door's Ring camera, climbing into a red truck parked across the street almost totally out of frame. But even in the glimpse of it available in the video, I could tell it was the same one when I saw the 2x4s and blue tarp. My stomach sank as I watched Amber hurry down the driveway, looking once over her shoulder to the safety of the house she was abandoning, then reaching the truck and climbing into the passenger seat before it took off up the road. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a beleaguered sigh. So Amber Wicker was her name, and as far as the police knew, she was missing. But I knew she was dead. After all, every customer that had walked in beneath the flickering sign had been a corpse, and as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I assumed her case wasn't any different. So, as much as I wanted to stop working at that place, as much as it bothered me to see those ghosts walking the faded paths of their memories through the purgatory that was the pass and go off 84th Avenue, I had to stay. I had to wait until Amber came back, so I could gather enough evidence to give to police. After all, though some of the dead only came in once, like the biker, others had come in twice, like Officer Brady, and even others had come in on almost a weekly basis, like the scratch-off lady. Eventually, I hoped she would come back. And so, the rest of July, I picked up more night shifts, desperately wanting to be there the night she hopefully returned. I also chatted with Justin, the guy who I'd shadowed and who worked nights when I was off, but his brain seemed constantly fried on something, and if he'd had any paranormal experiences, he hadn't noticed. I asked him about the sign flickering, and he said it did that on occasion, so I knew he'd seen at least some ghosts, but when I asked him about Amber, he wasn't sure if he'd seen her or not. Needless to say, I wasn't getting anything useful out of him. I asked him to just keep his eyes open for her, and if he saw her, to note the license plate of the truck by the pump. You'd think such a strange request would raise an eyebrow, but he was so zombified on whatever the hell it was he was abusing in his off time that he just said, "Sure." In the weeks after I'd pinned down Amber's true identity, I began to research her a bit. I could only find 2 articles about her. One was the one I first found, which just had the basic details of her disappearance, and the other was an even smaller article in which her parents had given a statement and a number to call if anyone knew anything. I really wanted to call that number, but I knew that right now I honestly didn't have shit. I could always say I was at the gas station that night and saw something, but the security camera footage only went back 60 days, so there'd be no proof one way or the other. I didn't have a license plate, and I was a whole state over. I didn't have a lot of faith the police would be able to do much with that, and I didn't want to give her parents false hope. So I decided I'd just wait until her memory replayed again, and I could piece together some actionable details. In the meantime, the more I searched her, I was at last able to find some of her socials, but her Instagram was private, and her Twitter was inactive for years. Though, when I stumbled upon her Facebook, even though it too hadn't had a post uploaded in 2 years, I felt strangely more connected to her as I scrolled through her photos. This immortal anthology of a dead girl's time on Earth, floating in cyberspace for anyone to find, and sharing her memories from before her life was prematurely snuffed out. I found pictures of her laughing with her friends, smiling at a dance, blowing out birthday candles. I saw random posts ranging from her excitedly proclaiming she'd gotten her learner's permit to complaining about failing some biology test. All these moments of this girl's life, both significant and insignificant, were here forever. Memories accessible to anyone that cared to find them. And really, her appearance at the gas station wasn't much different. Though that memory was supernatural, unfolding in real time over a real place, it was, in essence, the same. Just some moment of her existence that unaffiliated people such as myself were able to witness. Though whether or not I had been the one to see it for a reason, or my witnessing of it was just as inconsequential and random as me scrolling through her Facebook page, I felt that I was a part of this girl's story now, and it was my duty to help her however I could. But by August, she still hadn't come back, and strangely, neither had Officer Brady or the biker, or even the scratch-off lady. There was only one other occurrence of the sign flickering, and I guess it was either a no-show ghost or a fuck you from the universe, because no one ended up coming in. I got worried that whatever supernatural phenomenon had been taking place was over just as suddenly as it had begun, and that I'd never see her again, never be given a chance to atone for my apathetic complacency that night when I could have paid more attention to a situation that was obviously suspicious. And, even worse, I was shipping off to college in just a couple of weeks. My remaining days at the pass and go were numbered. So, on August 3rd, while sitting behind the counter in the dead of night, waiting for the purgatorial replay of an apparition's final stop on the drive to her untimely death, I made up my mind. If she didn't come in tonight, then tomorrow I'd take matters into my own hands. It dawned on me that Amber must have died nearby here. The only ghosts that ever walked into this gas station were those that had died on 84th Avenue. And that was true for Officer Brady, who had been shot just down the road, the biker who had crashed into the canal by the bend, the scratch-off lady who had hanged herself in the woods, and all the others I'd seen walk through those doors beneath the flickering green glow. And though I had no idea where to look, I had one thing to go off of. I'd seen the truck turn right at the turnoff. So, somewhere north of here, she must have died. And maybe, just maybe, I could figure out where. By morning, I still hadn't seen her, or any ghost for that matter, and after chatting with Tegan, my morning relief, I walked out to my car. But though I'd planned on driving home and getting some sleep, then searching later, I just couldn't resist the urge to look right then and there. And so, in my pass-and-go uniform and all, I walked over to the turnoff where I'd seen that phantom truck head right, and then did the same, walking north up the road. The sun was just barely rising over the trees, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd appreciated a sunrise. Usually, I sped home, trying to beat the sunlight to my room where I could shut my blackout curtains and crash as if it were still night. Then I'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. But this morning, moving slowly up the road along the canal and constantly scanning for anything out of the ordinary, I couldn't help but enjoy the orange glow above the trees. By the time I'd walked about 2 miles, the sun was fully above the horizon, and cars were starting to sparingly appear on 84th, though admittedly not many, as this wasn't the most direct route to anywhere in town except the pass and go. I'd already passed the infamous bend, and even felt obligated to pause there a moment before the canal, sort of waiting in reverent silence as I remembered the stare that Biker had given me, the regret permeating his eyes. By now, though, it could no longer be considered a canal. It was a drainage ditch at best, a muddy, shallow dip off the road, and beyond it was the forest. But then, in my steady scan of the ground in front of me, I noticed something twinkling. I crouched, looking down at small shards of glass on the pavement. Almost like a vision, my mind seemed to play out this simulation, and I was staring at the man as he and Amber argued. He lost his temper and slammed her head into the window, shattering it. I noticed more twinkling coming from the grass before the ditch, and I could almost hear the sound of his boots scraping the asphalt as he kicked the glass off down the hill, trying to cover up anything that had happened. Then I noticed something yellow peeking out of the mud. I stepped down into the ditch, grabbing the corner of the plastic and pulling it out of its muddy tomb. Sitting in my hand was a faded, dirty bag of Lay's Classic, mostly empty, with just a few crumbs at the bottom. My heart raced as I recalled her placing the bag on the counter, and again, I could see it before my mind's eye. The man dragging her body out of the passenger seat, her deadweight foot scraping the bag out with her. He probably didn't even notice in his panic as he dragged her toward the forest, the bag fluttering off down into the ditch below. I walked up the hill on the other side. I stepped into the forest. My breathing started to become heavy as I walked deeper into the trees, terrified as I anticipated just what nightmarish spectacle I might be about to find. But I wouldn't turn back now. And as the afterimage of Amber's conflicted eyes appeared in my mind again, I resolved to find where she was buried so I could finally give her parents peace. Maybe even give her peace. And it didn't take much more walking to find clues. I noticed 2 hardly visibly scrapes in the dirt, where her shoes must have been dragging. I carefully followed them, stepping off toward a cluster of trees as they suddenly turned, at last freezing before what I could immediately ascertain was a shallow grave. The grass all around it was undisturbed, but here, in just this plot, was a clump of uneven earth. Some grass and leaves had been precariously scattered on top in the man's frantic attempt to conceal it, but it wasn't convincing. And as I crouched before the plot, my heart began to thump out of my chest. But I gulped and steeled myself, knowing I had to see this all the way through for Amber. I wished I had a shovel, but with nothing else I just dug with my hands, scraping the dirt away and trying not to consider the possibility of my fingers abruptly touching her corpse. I jerked as I felt something that wasn't soil. Didn't feel like rotting flesh. So I brushed the sand away, and my eyes centered upon a filthy blue tarp immured in the ground. It was all I needed to see. I stayed right there, pulling out my phone and calling the police. And when they arrived within the hour, I told them I'd gone on a morning walk after getting off the graveyard shift, but noticed the broken glass and trash on the side of the road. They applauded me on my intuition, saying they probably wouldn't have found that suspicious at all. And, hell, I certainly wouldn't have either if I hadn't known the context. From there, I said I walked into the forest out of curiosity, but when I found what looked to be a trail left by dragging feet, I became convinced I'd actually found something serious. And, after a little bit of digging where the ground looked abnormal, I'd seen the tarp and assumed the worst. They were kinder than cops had ever been with me as they thanked me. And in just a couple of days, it was confirmed in a news story that wrapped in that tarp and left to rot in the woods off 84th Avenue for the last half a year was none other than the body of Amber Wicker. The girl with black hair and big brown eyes, taking her next big step in life. The last big step she'd ever take. I was glad I had been able to help her family get some closure, and hell, even lead to the arrest of the bastard that killed her, whose DNA was recovered at the scene of the crime. But even still, at the end of the day, none of that would bring her back. I just felt hollow. Finding her body, providing her parents whatever relief they could find, and putting that monster in jail still wouldn't bring that innocent, naive girl back to life. And as I listened to a podcast on the graveyard shift on my last night of work at the Pass and Go, 4 days before I'd be heading off to college, I found myself constantly distracted thinking about that. But slowly, I got my mind off things, paying more attention to the podcast and starting to stare off into space at last, the shift beginning to fly by, until just after 4 in the morning. I gasped as the neon sign flickered. I darted over to the side of the counter and peered over the cigarettes. I'll never be able to describe the feeling in my chest at the sight of that old red truck. And though I felt ice in my veins at the afterimage of Amber's killer pumping gas in the dark, when I found her walking to the front of the store, all that remained in my heart was an overwhelming longing, an inconsolable despair. She walked into the store, the chime on the ceiling ringing as she headed right over to the snacks. I stared at her undamaged body, her clean black hair, her innocent big brown eyes. I became emotional at the sight of it, trying desperately not to cry. She grabbed the bag of Lay's. Then she walked over to the sports drinks and I leaned against the counter, my chin in my palm as I gazed at this specter, retracing the final moments of her life, none the wiser to the horrible demise awaiting her 2 miles away. She grabbed a red Gatorade, then walked over to me, and I felt breathless as she approached, unsure of what I'd even say. "Whoa, you all right?" She looked at me, and I must have been hiding how I felt even worse than I realized. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, scanning the items like a robot. I cleared my throat. "What brings you out here this late?" "Nothing really." The total came up on the screen. "Big brother?" I limply asked, nudging my head toward the heartless man in the dark. "Ew. No. It's gross to have a brother." I must have asked the question differently this time, because she stared deeper at me, asking again, "You sure you're okay, dude?" God, I wanted so badly to tell her to run, to just get the fuck out of here. to not ever go near that man again. I wanted to tell her that she was about to die, that he was her murderer, that these were the very final minutes of her life. But this was not a time machine. It was no different than that Facebook page from years ago. Just a memory inexplicably suspended in time. Just a brief expression of her existence that was as ephemeral an experience as her time on Earth. And nothing more. Can I ask you something? She raised an eyebrow. Sure. Have you ever done something totally crazy, just overnight? She blinked wildly, visibly taken aback by the words. Yeah, actually, she murmured. Yeah, I have. Why do you ask? I shrugged. No reason. What about you? Yeah, I did once. I had this weird inkling to follow a trail into the woods, and I found a body. Called the police and reported it. Creepy, she remarked. I let out a long sigh, handing her the stuff. Hey, this is on me tonight, all right? Oh, sure. How come? You just look like a friend of mine. I smiled hollowly. A friend I haven't seen in a while. Anyway, it's my treat. Well, all right. Thanks. She took her unceremonious last meal, then turned over to the door, walking toward the oscillating neon. Have a good rest of your night, Carter. She glanced at my name tag, smiling slightly at me. It broke my heart. You too, Amber. Huh? I said you too. She stood there a moment, as if debating whether or not she'd heard me right the first time. Then she turned around and walked outside. But I couldn't just sit there, and before I knew it, I was running around the counter, shoving the doors open and stepping outside. I bit my tongue at the gash on the back of her head, the blood dripping down her hair and onto the back of her top. I had guessed that that had been the cause of her death, but evidently I was wrong. Because as she turned back toward me, I found her blue face and the purplish bruising of a seatbelt around her neck. Her clothes were covered in dirt and blood, and the Lay's bag was empty and faded, mud clumped all over it. The bottle of Gatorade was halfway empty. I trembled as I found her teary gaze, the desperation and regret staining her painfully cognizant big brown eyes, not innocent anymore. Thank you, she whispered. I couldn't possibly muster a response. And then Amber turned, the afterimage of her corpse climbing into the passenger side door of her murderer's truck. I remained frozen in place, my eyes following every last fleeting second of Amber's existence as the taillights glowed and the engine hummed. Then the truck pulled off, pausing at the turnoff. And then, as it pulled away, turning right on 84th Avenue and heading to her shallow grave, the neon of the sign stopped flickering, leaving me standing there alone again in silence. May sighed with relief as she lowered her weary body to the side of the bed. Slowly, feeling every muscle and joint in her body protest, she shuffled herself into position and slid her legs between the sheets. I'd forgotten how tiring it can be running after a child, she breathed, as she propped up her pillow and settled herself against it. It's been a long time, replied Graham, not looking up from his book. May and Graham's son, Peter, and his wife and child were visiting from the eastern states for Christmas. May had spent the whole day taking care of her grandchild, Jacob, while Peter and his wife traveled to the nearest city to do some last-minute Christmas shopping. That was the one downside of May and Graham's idyllic property in the West Australian outback. It was a half-hour drive to the nearest town, which had precious few amenities itself, and to get any real shopping done, the only viable option was to travel to Mildura, over 2 hours away. When Peter and Helen had gone out to buy Jacob's Christmas presents, they decided to make a day of it so as to make the round trip worthwhile. Graham put his book down and took his glasses off. "I don't know why they left it so late," he grumbled. "It's Christmas Eve. It must be chaos out there." They didn't want Jacob to find the presents, May reminded him. "He's getting to that age where he's curious and prone to snoop. It would be such a shame to ruin the magic when he's only 4 years old." May became misty-eyed as she remembered her son at that age. I'll never forget the wonder in Peter's eyes on Christmas morning when he woke up to a pillowcase full of presents from Santa. That's one thing you haven't forgotten, at least. Graham responded a little gruffly, but then he turned to May and smiled, squeezing her hand. It's good to remember those days. The couple sat in companionable silence for some time before May asked, "How did you manage to hide the Christmas gifts from Peter?" At this, Graham laughed. "Your mind is playing tricks on you again, love. You were the one who organized Peter's Christmas presents." May frowned. "No, that isn't right, is it? I bought Peter's Christmas present from us, but you arranged all the presents from Santa." Graham shook his head firmly. "No, that wasn't me." Confused, May sat and tried to concentrate on those memories, methodically going back through the years, right up to Peter's first Christmas in 1985. A creeping sense of dread trickled through May's body. She was so sure she hadn't bought Peter's Christmas presents herself, had no memory of placing them under the tree. But who did? Out here in the middle of nowhere, or near enough to. Who else even could have? As if reading her thoughts, Graham suggested, perhaps it was Santa Claus. "Don't tease," snapped May, hating how thin and querulous her voice sounded to her own ears. "I hate it when you tease." Graham just laughed softly. That feeling of dread settled firmly in May's chest, tugging at her heart. She suddenly felt that she couldn't possibly sleep. "I'm going to wait up for Peter," she announced. "Don't be like that," Graham cajoled. "You're just misremembering things again, that's all. Come back to bed." "What? No, that's not it," May lied. "I'm just worried about Peter and Eileen. I want to see that they get home safe." Graham grunted at this. "All right then, love. Just try not to wake me when you come back to bed. Early morning tomorrow." He rolled over and almost immediately began to snore. The tightness in May's chest loosened somewhat. May padded out to the living room in her fuzzy slippers. She stood there indecisively for a moment before creeping up to the room next to hers and Graham's and opening the door ever so carefully. The curtain in this room was open, and the moonlight streamed through, illuminating the form of her slumbering 4-year-old grandson. May smiled softly as she watched the steady rise and fall of Jacob's back as he lay belly first on the bed that used to be his father's. May's heart swelled with love and pride. She couldn't believe how much Jacob had grown. It seemed like only a moment ago he was a newborn. In fact, it didn't really seem like that long since Peter himself had been this age. The thought brought a tinge of sadness to her mood, and her smile faltered somewhat as she gently closed the door and moved back to the lounge room. Shuffling up to the sofa, May made sure to turn on the lamp rather than the room light so as not to disturb Graham or Jacob. She settled into her usual spot with a sound somewhere between a wheeze and a sigh. Why was it that she didn't seem to be able to do anything these days without an accompanying sound breaking forth unintended and unwanted? How long had things been like this? When had she become old? May picked up the magazine that was sitting beside her, but almost immediately put it down again listlessly. She cast her eyes around the room, and they settled on the Christmas tree, its little yellow lights twinkling merrily. The base of the tree was cluttered with wrapped gifts, and right up front and center was Jacob's still empty Santa sack that he had placed out with such excitement several hours ago before May settled him for bed. May thought again of her conversation with Graham a few minutes earlier. "Perhaps my mind is slipping," she mused unhappily. "The rest of me seems to be anyway." As she thought this, May found herself starting to doze. Her dreams always began the same way, abstract and fragmented. Images and sounds flashed through her consciousness so frantically that she was never able to grasp onto any one thing, certainly not long enough to be able to remember when she awoke. Gradually, though, the dream seemed to choose its form and crystallize. Tonight, May dreamt of this very house, not the way it was now, all decked out in its Christmas finery, but the way it was when she was a child living there with her own parents. As with most dreams of her childhood, it was a happy one. She dreamt of her father picking her up and spinning her through the air when he returned from his farm chores. She dreamt of her mother's apple and rhubarb pie and of standing on tiptoes at the kitchen bench to watch as her mother neatly crimped the edges of the pastry with her worn but still deft fingers. There were no siblings to dream of course, but there was a seemingly endless stream of cats. Snowball, Gretchen, Rugby, and all the others, each making a brief but touching appearance, all remembered fondly. She dreamed also of her dearest friend who had once lived there, too. Her happy friend with all his arms for hugging and his wrinkled, jolly face so big it seemed to fill up the entire room as he smiled and smiled and smiled. May awoke with a start, and with one name on her lips. "Mr. Spindle," she whispered reverently. How long had it been since she had last thought of her old imaginary friend? She hadn't forgotten, though, she realized with a kind of pride. He'd been waiting for her all this time at the very edge of her subconscious. She got up to make herself a cup of tea. The kitchen had changed since she was a child, but perhaps not as much as one might expect. The benches and cabinets were all the same, and although they had installed a new gas oven some 20 years ago or so, the old wood-fired stove still occupied its place against the back wall. Sometimes, on cold winter days, they would light it to warm the place up. It was hot and muggy tonight, of course, so the wood stove remained cold and empty. May lay a hand tenderly on its surface as she waited for the kettle to boil. That's where Mr. Spindle had lived, behind the oven. May had been a lonely child, with no siblings of her own, and no other children at all within a reasonable distance. She had cats, but cats weren't always the warmest of companions, especially for a young child. And so she had invented Mr. Spindle. Mr. Spindle was big and friendly, and smelled like cinnamon toast. He had a huge round face. In fact, he was mostly face, with only a stick of a body, much like a very young child's drawing of a person. He could make himself flat like a picture, too. He would shrink himself down and fold himself up so that he fit neatly in the narrow gap between the stove and the wall. May made her cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, all while looking at the old oven. These days, May often found that memories did not come easily. She had to focus carefully to ease facts and forms out of the tangled mass of her own mind. And even when she was sure of herself, Graham often insisted she was wrong. After her dream, though, the memories of Mr. Spindle came, if not flooding back, then at least trickling like a clear creek. May remembered, for instance, that she used to write letters to Mr. Spindle. Well, perhaps write was generous, as she did not even know how to read at the time, but she would scribble on bits of paper. When she was sure her mother wasn't looking, she would open up the door to the oven and slip the notes into the fire. Mr. Spindle would sometimes leave her gifts in return. She would reach behind the oven and find some gum nuts or scraps of paper bark, the shimmering feather of a satin bowerbird. Sometimes there were even small toys, little dolls made from wooden clothes pegs, a tiny teddy bear. May frowned a little at this memory. Where had the gifts come from? She could imagine putting the things from the garden there herself, even if she could not remember doing so. But what about the toys? It must have been her mother, she decided. Her mother must have noticed her playing around at the back of the stove and decided to join the game. This didn't feel quite right. Her mother had been a serious, though loving, woman, and not given to whimsy. In fact, May had the sense that had she known May was messing around the stove, she would have gotten a stern talking to. Could she really have been hiding a lighter side all along? It must have been her mother. Or perhaps it was her father. May sighed heavily. Perhaps she really was losing her memory. She tapped her fingernails absently upon the kitchen table, and gradually the tapping became a tune. May started to hum until eventually words came. Mr. Spindle is neat as a pin. He has a great, big, funny grin. Mr. Spindle lives behind the stove. He is very, very, very old. Mr. Spindle brings me gifts and toys. He does not even have a voice. Mr. Spindle is my dearest friend. He'll be there with me at the end. May chuckled softly to herself. Why was it there always seemed to be a macabre tinge to the imagination of children? Were they even aware of it? Was she when she sang the made-up song happily to herself as a child? May looked at the kitchen clock as she drained the dregs of her tea. Past midnight, and still no sign of Peter and Eileen. She had waited up for 4 hours now, if you excused the period when she had dozed off. Anxiety tugged at May's chest, but she chastised herself. He's a grown man. He can look after himself. She shuffled back into the lounge room and settled herself once more on the couch. May watched the lights on the tree as they flickered on and off in a series of repeating patterns. Despite the nap and the tea, she still felt drowsy. Her eyelids drooped, and she hovered at the very precipice of sleep. A loud click startled May out of her dozy state. The door, she thought as she heaved herself up off the couch. Finally. Peter had his own keys, of course, but May wanted to meet her son at the door. She was already smiling as she turned the latch and swung open the wooden door. She was greeted, however, by nothing but the muggy summer night. May frowned and peered out into the darkness. No car. But she was so sure she heard them arriving. Disappointed and a little disoriented, May closed the door. As she turned to make her way back to the lounge room, she heard that clicking sound again. A little louder, and followed swiftly by a series of other clicks and taps. The sound was coming from inside, she realized. Something must have gotten in, May thought resignedly. Out here there were plenty of critters and creepy crawlies who did, unfortunately, have a way of making it into the house every now and then. Beside the Christmas tree, a broom was propped up to sweep away the stray needles. May grabbed it and, so armed, headed off to try and track the source of the clicking. The hallway was empty. No clicking there. She opened her bedroom door, but the only noise she found there was Graham's soft snoring. May approached the sewing room, where Jacob was sleeping in his father's old bed. She decided against opening the door, and instead pressed an ear to the thin wood and listened. Nothing. May let out a little huff of frustration and decided to give up and return to the lounge room. As she made her way back, she heard the noise again coming from a little further up the hallway. The kitchen. May left the light out as she entered the kitchen. She didn't want whatever had broken into the house to scuttle off under the fridge before she had a chance to get at it. Besides, the tree lights in the adjoining lounge room gave off sufficient, if inconsistent, lighting for her to make her way. May's eyes swept the room as she entered, running along the skirting boards, around the window frames, even across the ceiling. She sniffed and was met with a smell like slightly burnt toast. Surely she hadn't left the toaster on. She looked at the kitchen bench and saw the toaster, inert and tucked safely away. May's heart began to pound as the smell intensified. Could it be a stroke? Is this really how it all happens? She could hear the clicking noise still, but it no longer held her attention. Frantically, her eyes flickered to the gas stove, also off, before finally alighting on the old wood-fired oven. May froze. Something familiar but impossible was creeping out of the space behind the oven. A number of limbs, too many, too long, and with too many joints, seemed to unfold out of the shadows. They clicked and creaked as they stretched further out into the kitchen. Each limb ended in a kind of pincer, and each pincer held tight in its grip. A toy, a fluffy teddy bear, a tiny train set, even some sort of handheld gaming device. The thing somehow dragged them all out of the tiny space between the oven and the wall. As May looked at the toys, she noticed that none of them seemed quite whole. The teddy bear was missing an arm, and from the unfinished seam at its side hung strands of an oddly iridescent thread. The same threads hung from the other toys. Even the gaming device seemed to be somehow unraveling from the back, where the batteries should go. Gradually, the thing behind the stove revealed more of itself. An eye the size of a basketball peeked out of the shadows as the thing slowly revealed its body, which really was just an enormous, wrinkled head. Its huge, broad mouth was twisted into a manic grin, so wide it seemed to almost encircle the thing's entire head. Its teeth chattered and lips flapped in a parody of speech, but no sound came out but for the click, 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 as the teeth met. More of those glimmering threads hung in loops from between the huge, blunt teeth. The flesh of the thing, both on its immense head and covering its many, many arms, appeared plush and velvety, which in combination with the wrinkles made May think, incongruously, of a pug. Except, where puppies wriggled and wagged, this thing seemed to vibrate slightly, its whole body shivering in little spasms. Up and down, up and down. As the thing advanced, the burnt toast smell became stronger, undercut now with something sweet and spicy, like cinnamon donuts or gingerbread. May could taste the sickly combination at the back of her throat. Somewhere inside May, something broke. As she clutched her chest, ambivalence reigned in her racing heart. She was terrified, of course, but also strangely triumphant. Gasping, she fell to her knees and, in that moment, realized two things with perfect clarity. Her memory was as sharp as it had ever been, and there was no such thing as Santa Claus.